I want to spend a lot of time on Henry George here because I think he's more important than Landreth and Colander give him credit. So we're going to talk a lot about Henry George. So he says a lot of interesting stuff. He has some good quotes. The name of political economy, this is before they changed the name to economic. The name of political economy has been constantly invoked against every effort of the working class to increase their wages. The idea of laissez-faire, oh, we shouldn't have unions, that's against laissez-faire. Oh, we shouldn't have labor regulations, that's against laissez-faire. And we have the iron law of wages and Malthusian economics that all say deviating from subsistence wages for the lower class is always a bad idea. All those things invoked against the working class trying to improve their position. Another quote, for the student of political economy, you need no special knowledge, no extensive library, no costly laboratory. You do not even need textbooks or teachers, if you will but think for yourselves. It's maybe going a bit far, but thinking for yourselves in a rationalist way is underappreciated world we live. And let me read this long quote. Let's see. This long quote from page 186. This quote gets you the essence of his theory. What he's known for is his theory of land rent, the single tax. Take now some hard-headed businessman who has no theories but knows how to make money. Say to him, there's a little village. In 10 years, it will be a great city. In 10 years, the railroad will have taken the place of the stagecoach, the electric light, the candle. It will abound with all the machinery improvements that so enormously multiply the effective power of labor. Will in 10 years interest be any higher? He will tell you no. Will the wages of a common laborer be any higher? He will tell you no, the wages of the common laborer will not be any higher. What then will be higher? Rent, the value of land. Get yourself a piece of ground, hold that position, and if, under such circumstances, you take his advice, you need do nothing more. You may sit down and smoke your pipe. You may lie around like the Lazzaroni of Naples or the Laperos of Mexico. You may go out on a balloon or down the hole in the ground without doing one stroke of work. Without adding one iota of wealth to the community. In 10 years, you will be rich. In the new city, you may have a luxurious mansion because of the land you bought. But among its public buildings, there will be an almshouse. There will be poor people. And he writes this in his book, Progress and Poverty. What he's seeing around him is enormous progress. We have inventions happening at this time that nobody really anticipated. If you came around, as Heilbronner said, if somebody from ancient Egypt came around to Western Europe in the 16 or 17 or maybe the early 1700s, they wouldn't see anything that really struck them as crazy. Oh, you have better ships, but they're sailing ships. They work the way we used to. Oh, you have these windmill things. Those are really cool, but I can see how you made them with wood and the wind blows the sails, that makes sense, you know, but nothing that would really shock them. But when you get the steam engine and when you get electricity, you've got this world that nobody anticipated. You've got railroads coming in, you got canals being done, you got the steamship coming in, and you get a lot of other inventions that go along with that. High-rise buildings you get with the elevator. You've got all these things coming in that we can do things we never could before. But yet, and that's progress. That's what people were calling it progress, and people were recognizing it as progress. But what he's noticed is amid progress, you get poverty. Why is it that all this progress never ends poverty? And we can ask that same question 150 years later. We've had way more progress since Henry George's time. Still, we have poverty. The benefits of this progress don't go to everyone. So he wants to determine why. And he's determined, well, and he determines that for the logic that is in that long quote that I read, he determined that the problem is rent, not just on land, but on natural resources. And in the world today, those natural resources can think of things that he wouldn't have thought of, like the broadcast spectrum. In most countries in the world, the broadcast spectrum is given away by free. Governments give that away for free to cell phone companies, television companies, internet companies. They sell it back to us, capturing not only the value that they produce when they make their cell phones, but the value of that scarce piece of real estate in the broadcast spectrum. These kinds of things, money goes to people who own stuff, not to people who do stuff. That's my phrase, not his. But that's definitely, it's derived from Henry George, but this is also a little bit of Ricardo and a little bit of Thomas Paine. He's definitely inspired by Ricardo and Thomas Paine. And probably he didn't know Spence, who was saying things like this. But he takes it a lot farther than they do into a theory of economics. So he looks at the determinants of the value of land, real estate, and other things. One thing that determines the value of land is the improvements made by landlords. You take a vacant spot, you put a nice building on it, it makes it more valuable. But there's also the values of the resources. The fertility and the resources, the value of the soil. Why is land so much more valuable in Qatar and UAE and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia than it is in Yemen? Because those countries have oil and Yemen doesn't. That's why Yemen is so poor. So that there is the value of it could be, if it's farming, for the fertility of the soil, and then there's the value of whatever resources happen to be on it. Okay, Mo?
I wanted to ask, why does the author claim that George's mechanical diagnosis is superficial and faulty, but it remains sort of moral, and his moral sort of justification is one that leads to conversation by I just don't understand the sort of economic wall or the logical wall.
Well, okay. Let me get to that. Let me explain his theory on his terms, and we'll get to that issue. Okay. Now, so there's what determines the value of land? Improvements made by a landlord, the natural resource value of the land itself, and then there is the locational value. Location value is huge, and locational value is determined by a lot of other things. What determines the locational value of good? All workers in the area determine the locational value of a piece of property. You want to locate your business where there's a bunch of people doing business, where there's a bunch of people producing things. You want to be near what's going on. You want to locate your home where there are working coffee shops and restaurants and stores and dealerships and whatever else you might need, and jobs. So you want to live near where all these things are. That is created by everybody who works in that area. It's also created by the entrepreneurs in the area, the investors that go out and create those businesses. It's created by them. It's also created by government infrastructure spending. If a government builds a highway, it's going to make the land right next to the highway a lot less valuable, because it's really unpleasant to live right next to that highway. But it's going to make the land a little away from the highway. I mean, talking about, the big interstate, big expressway. A little bit away from it is going to make it a lot more valuable because it's easier to get to. The government in the when I got here 15 years ago, there was no metro system. One day, the government opened the metro system that it had built with people's money, and that changed the real estate value of every place in Qatar, making the places near the stops more valuable. Now, Qatar's not well built for a metro, so it didn't have as big effect as I'm sure it did in New York, which is built to be very walkable. And when they built all that infrastructure, it greatly affected their land. So government infrastructure spending. And now the value, so all of those things determine location value. All workers in the area, all entrepreneurs in the area, and government spending in the area. All of those things determine the value of the location value of property. And you know who's not included in those people who do those things? The landlord themselves. All the landlord has to do is own. The landlord doesn't even have to. The landlord doesn't even have to manage the land. They can hire somebody to do that for them. The landlord just receives money. And the value goes up. The more activity there is in an area, the more the land goes up. The more the land value goes up. There are places in the United States where the land value is so high, working class people can't afford to live there. And some they're actually like busing in working class people from far away places or building dormitories for them so they can have their lower class, enough of their lower class to work the land to keep those values up. He also produced a business cycle theory related to land speculation. One thing that you get, if you've got this system where the real money is in owning land and other natural resources, and you have a market in that, people are going to realize that, and you're going to have a lot of speculation in land. What land's going to become more valuable? What's going to become less valuable? Should I buy 10 of these things? Now, it's gotten to the point in London where you get land is so valuable and speculative, the belief that it's ever going to increase. You got people who are just buying chunks of London and not even renting the land out, just leaving it sit there, presuming that eventually the value of that land is going to catch up and they're going to make money off that. At least, and it's not going to go down very much. So at least it's a safe place to put your land. Whereas if you buy a company, that company could go out of business, you could lose everything. If you buy land in London, you can be pretty sure it's never going to zero. It might go down a bit, not to lose everything. So you can just buy land and just leave it sit there, probably going to make money, and you're not going to lose your shirt. But he comes up with this dynamic 19-year business cycle theory based on a regular amount of speculation and crash and speculation and crash. And I'm sure there is some speculation and crash, but how well he had that right, I don't know. And what he has then, but what this shows for the growth of the economy was he sees this growth in the economy, if we don't take action to change it, will ever cause more inequality, progress, and poverty. The value of the progress will go to the people who own stuff, not the people who do stuff, for this reason. He didn't use this graph. This is Alfred Marshall's graph, but it's easy to see it in these terms if you know this graph. Well, the demand for labor is going to be the demand like anything else. Demand slopes down. Not the demand for labor, demand for land is going to be like anything else. But the supply of land is going to be fixed. There's only so much land in this location. There's only so much land in the world. It doesn't change. So the supply is fixed. When there's economic growth, demand shifts out. When demand shifts out, land values go up and landowners receive more of the things that all people work together. That is his theory. Now, that is the base of it. As demand increases, the price of land goes up, allowing the people who own the resources of the world to capture more of that value at the expense of everybody else. And this is, if you've read the contemporary economist Thomas Piketty, I don't. His name is, he's French, but his name is not French origin, so I have no idea how the actual pronunciation. I'm sure he pronounces it some French way, because it looks like Piketty, but for Piketty. But he has this phrase you can paraphrase is as the entrepreneur eventually becomes a rentier. Sure, you're an entrepreneur for a while, you make maybe billions now. You can't be an entrepreneur forever, but you take those billions and they're invested in your company, or they're invested in something the company has resources or controls something like that, and you eventually become a rentier. So a lot of our money is going to rentiers. Now, I think the Heilbronner's criticism of them, I think, is based more on the economics of it. He wrote these two really long books, not that long, but Social Problems and Progress in Poverty. And when I've read these books, and I find there's some chapters that are just exceedingly naive. And then there's some chapters that I find just brilliant. And then others that I find really naive again. And what I think Heilbronner, and what he's trying to do there is not just this is a very strong moral complaint about the way our economy works. But he's trying to do more than that. He's trying to revolutionize economics and trying to build an entire theory of economics to rival the neoclassical revolution going on at the time, which he hasn't read that much of, so he's still using things, a lot of classical techniques in economics. So he doesn't succeed in revolutionizing economics. And that's where I think Heilbronner is talking about the naivete of that part. But whether he had a sophisticated full-blown theory of how the economy works, he's still got this moral complaint about how the economy works. And I want to ask you all, what do you think of his moral complaint about the world we live in? Wait, sorry. Before I do that, I should get to his solution. Then his solution is the single tax, is that the government should become the ultimate rentier. We don't need tax. We don't need income taxes. We don't need capital gains taxes or sales taxes. If the government simply owns the resources, rents those out to the capitalist class, then it charges that rent up to the highest possible level instead of just letting capitalists own the money own these resources forever, charges the highest sustainable rent, then the government, as the ultimate landlord, can take that money and use it for the good of the people, replacing all those taxes that entrepreneurs and workers and everybody pays. Replace that. Instead of paying your rent, you pay your taxes. The money you're paying taxes twice. The landlord is taxing you. The resource owner is, I guess, 3 times. The resources owners are taxing you for every little resource-based thing you buy, like there's all these precious minerals in here, and all the energy we use for this stuff. And then you're taxed by the government because the government is starved for funds, because the natural place for the government to get its money is going to the landlords. Cut them out, socialize the rent, and have a market system put on top of a rental, of a socialized rental economy. That's the George's solution. What do y'all think? Okay.
I had a question earlier. I mean, it's a rhetorical question about the fact that when we talk about growth and poverty and so on, or progress, when you talk about progress, the idea is that why do we continue to progress and we have development and technological capabilities, but the class issue remains the same. We still have people that are well better off, and we still have people in the working class, no matter if we're using tallow and coal or if you were using solar and oil and so on. So the idea is that I think his solution could sort of bridge that gap between diminishing that like class gap and have progress that really leads to equality. And I think it's a matter of inequality that he tries to sort of shed light on.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, Omar.
If I understand theory correctly, this is in effect like social welfare cranked up to 11. So in theory, it sounds good. You know, you funnel the resources you get from the economy back into the economy. You make more happy people. You make more efficient workers. The economy boosts itself, and this is like a sort of repeating cycle. So that not only is the economy healthier and the government gets more money, in effect, everyone's happier. If I'm understanding this correctly. When you apply that to real life, I hesitate to say that it would actually work because something like this goes wrong. There's always some sort of like wrench in the system.
Yeah. Well, okay, when you say it's like social welfare cranked to 11, I want to say how very different it is than the Marxist solution. Marxist, remember, is seen. Okay, I didn't mention this, but Marx has talked about how the landowning class and the entrepreneurial class have merged. And these are just the ownership class, and they own everything. And he doesn't make that much of a distinction. Now, what George is about is about separating the income on the things that entrepreneurs are really doing, choosing where to invest and choosing the right things to invest in, and running those businesses in an efficient way that's going to improve our economy. That money he wants them to keep, but the money that just comes from ownership, all of that goes to the state and then back to the people. So it is something that some of the observations here are similar to Marx, but where he goes with it are very different. He still wants all the benefits of the market, but he wants the government as the ultimate landlord to return those benefits to the people. So in that sense, it is a very different way of combining socialism and capitalism than is usually suggested. And it's also very different than what you have in the most active social welfare systems, in the Nordic model. In theirs, you get a lot of government ownership of industry, and you get a lot of power of unions. Whether you could have that with a Georgia system as well, but the driving thing for Marx was worker control of factories and the factory system and all the research with it. But his is not worker control. It is citizen benefit on these things. Okay, Sharush.
For me, it was like a really well-known argument, but I never knew that Henry George was the one with who it originated. But in Pakistan, you hear this dialogue quite frequently where people tell you that land will always go up in value. That's why the safest bet is just buy land. And it keeps on going on in a cycle. And ordinary men who have never studied economics in a classroom say this stuff. Yeah. That this is some hard-headed businessman says. But the problem with his solution that I see in Pakistan as well with the taxing is that power has a tendency to go to those who are at the top of the ladder, which in this case are also the landlords because they're accumulating the most wealth. And what happens in Pakistan usually is that when that wealth goes up the ladder to the landlords, they concentrate the development towards the areas where they have properties. So those areas develop, and the areas on the periphery of those lands go up in value, and they buy more land on the sides.
Mhm.
And so a large chunk of people are left out who can who couldn't afford it before, and now are even less likely to ever be able to buy land to live on.
Yeah,
The government can't be a reliable fix to this problem because of this tendency of wealth to lead to power.
Mhm. Leo?
Yeah, this reminds me of the Chinese system. We have a similar thing that George has.
Mhm.
The government basically has the full ownership of the land, but in reality, all the corporations and all the kind of companies, they have the right to use the land instead of actually owning the land. They have the right to purchase the 99 years usage of the land, and they have the right to change stuff. And the Georgia system, it's kind of the reality and status quo in China, but it's very different in a way that it's a long-term ownership. It's not like George suggests that it's a year-by-year rentier. If it's a year-by-year rentier, the corporation would fear that their usage of the land is going to disappear next year. So they're not willing to invest and trying to increase the value of the land.
Yeah.
So that way, if it's a 9 years long rent, it's going to benefit the corporation in the sense that they have a guaranteed usage of the land. At the same time, the government still claim that the ownership of the land ultimately belongs to them.
Mhm.
But here comes the question that is the tax from selling the land enough for the for the company? For the government, and which turns out to be not enough, at least in the Chinese case. Even though lands are so precious and lands are so valuable, but at the end of the day, the lands taxes are not enough. Selling lands cannot drive the company and drive the financial status in the country. So there has to be other taxes.
Well, but the reason for that, I think that George has a response to that is the land taxes are not enough because the government is undercharging the landlords. But and those 99-year leases are part of that. They're charging way below the true land value of those areas. And the reason they do it is clear, because the government is run by the rich people who own all those companies in this supposedly communist country. And they're not renting out the broadcast spectrum at the highest sustainable level. They're not renting out all the mines in China at the highest sustainable level. There's a lot more George's things that China could do and is choosing not to do because the country, partly I don't know how well they know George there, but because it's in the people who make decisions for it are the ones who would pay more. Why should we pay more when we could tax the ordinary worker to support our system? So no, I think. Oh, do it. Did I see another hand?
Yes. So when I read about the single massive tax on the surface, it comes across as a regressive tax, because when we apply, similar to the example I was giving here, it would be applied to ordinary people, not just corporations, and it falls just a little bit short of nationalizing or expropriating personal property by the government. And I was wondering to try to phrase, I don't know exactly how I'm phrasing this, but wouldn't that be wouldn't the ordinary landlords who purchase land as a hope of getting a passive or secondary income, wouldn't that affect them more than corporations who charge higher rent to their rentees, even though the government ultimately is still receiving the rent?
Sorry, who is it with the passive income that it's going to affect?
Ordinary landlords
Yeah.
compared to corporate landlords.
Yeah. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. And first of all, is that it is a misconception that even in the United States, where where owning your own home is such a big ideal. It is really not true that most Americans own their own home. Many Americans, by the end of their life, own their own home. For most of their lives, their bank owns the home, and they're paying the bank and their interest. The interest on the bank, they're paying. So you've got to imagine a person, a homeowner throughout their life, not at the end of their life when they finally paid that off, when they're 60, 70 years old and they finally paid the bank off, to then spring the land tax on them. Yeah, that would be regressive. Well, it would be aggressive. It would be regressive to these middle class people that get to that point. But there's loads of Americans who never get to that point, who are renters their whole life. And it's obvious, your renter doesn't lose anything. Landlord loses anything. They cannot raise the rent because they cannot make that up by raising the rent because they're already charging the highest rent. That would just increase. If all the renters raised their prices, that would just be more for the government, not more for the rentiers. But imagine a person who wants to buy that home going through their life. When they buy it, the home is going to cost the price that you're paying to the bank and to the old owner of that home is going to go way down. But it's going to be made up by the taxman. You're going to pay that money in tax instead of to the bank and the previous landlord. But as that happens, you're not paying as what you're paying in income tax. You're not paying what you would pay in sales tax or other forms of taxes. So you're lowering these other taxes and increasing, this one, specifically coming out of the people who get money not for doing stuff, but for owning stuff. Tax what people own, not what they do, is the idea. Okay, now, let me ask you though, so I don't think China, even though it's nominally has government-owned land, I don't think China is really very close to the Georgist model. But there are countries in the world today that I think are pretty close to the Georgist model. What countries in the world today do you think are actually doing Georgism pretty effective? Not exactly, but pretty effective.
Switzerland?
Not that I know of. I don't know if Switzerland doing anything specific with resources. It has what's that?
Scandinavia.
No, Scandinavia is based on the traditional tax model. Well, to a large extent, not to a huge great. There's some of this going on in some parts of Scandinavia, but what we
It's the Nordic.
yeah, Scandinavia is they want to call them Nordic countries now instead of Scandinavian countries because they can never decide exactly what counts as Scandinavian. If you know Nordic, okay, we know that one's well defined. No,
Yeah.
but no, I think there are some that are closer to this model than I would say Norway is the closest of all of these, but of the ones you've mentioned. But I think there are some that are a lot closer than Norway.
Guyana?
What?
Guyana.
Guyana?
Guyana.
Guyana? I have to admit, I don't know much about the political situation in Guyana.
But they have UBI. I mean, they have partial UBI.
I don't know about it. But it's not about UBI. George was not UBI. He was about using this for government services. Although there are contemporary Georgists who are in favor of UBI, which they usually call a citizen's dividend, which is a UBI linked to land taxes and other resources. Well, I'll tell you what I think is the most Georgist country in the world today is the one we're sitting in right now, Qatar. This country it doesn't let the international capitalist countries come in, the international capitalist firms come in here and just take the resources and say, oh, we'll give you some jobs if you let us dig up that oil, and then you can tax our workers to support your government. That's what most countries, most resource exporting countries have done. They just do anything. Please come in here, international corporation. We'll lower the taxes for you. You give us some jobs. and then we'll tax those workers and they'll give us the money. But Qatar, like Norway, but to a greater extent than Norway, because it's more dependent on oil and gas, Qatar has said, we own all of this oil. And we're going to drive a hard bargain with BP and ExxonMobil and Shell and all those other oil companies. We're going to drive a really hard bargain with you. And you're basically going to get the value that you add from the drilling. But all the value of that oil is going to go to the Qatari government, and it's going to be held, and it's going to be used to give Qatari people better life. That's Georgia's. This isn't Georgia's country. Now, it's not exactly Georgia because there's a lot of inequality. Why do certain families get huge amounts and other families get very little? But the thing about it is there's so much to go around here, unlike Saudi. Well, I don't know, maybe they really didn't Saudi, but there's so much to go around here that they've virtually eliminated poverty in this country by making sure at least everybody gets at least some of those Georgia's rents going to them. So it's worked here, and it works also to some extent in Bahrain and Kuwait and Oman, to a lesser extent in Saudi Arabia and some others. And there's very few countries like that, but we're in one. We're in one. This is really, George, Henry George should be like, he should be famous in Qatar because he came up with a theory of what this country is really doing. Now, I think there's some problems in Qatar that are, one problem is what I mentioned, the inequality among Qataris. But I mean, inequality when the person at the bottom is decently well off is a lot less problematic when the person at the bottom is living in a tent and begging for food or eating out of somebody's dumpster like we have in the cities in the US. So it's a less of a problem, but it also comes with exploitation of foreign labor. Henry George didn't, well, what if you got one country that was really resource rich and they're the only one doing Georgism? Would that not give them an enormous opportunity to exploit foreign labor? Whereas I don't think the wealth that we have here is not to the extent, I don't feel, and when I say exploit foreign labor, I don't mean me. I'm fine. I'm well paid for, I would like to thank the Emir, Sheikh Moza, I'd like to thank everybody. I'm very well paid. This works, has been very, very good to me. But we could be way better. We could have fewer of the working class here and pay them much better. And this could be just a wonderful, wonderful place if we do. And I say we because you can't just blame the Qataris for this. If you're in this class, you are benefiting. You are benefiting from the labor of all those people. It's not just Qataris benefiting from that. You're a part of this. We're part of that. We're part of the divide, but we're benefiting from that labor. So I think Georgians is really important. I'm not a Georgist because, partly because Georgists are like a cult these days. If you don't believe everything George ever wrote his entire life was completely brilliant, we hate you. You're against us. So that's part of the reason, but also because I think some of the stuff that he wrote was just kind of, and some of the basics of it are already there in Ricardo and already there in Thomas Paine's and Thomas Paine and Thomas Spence. That was the other. But I do think that this criticism of our economy is a big thing. And I also think, now, one response when I say something like that, and Norway is doing it with its oil. And Alaska, to a minor extent, is doing it with its oil. But Norway has captured 70% of the revenue from exporting oil that it's gotten from. So it gets the international companies to come in. The international companies get only 70% of the revenue, and they're still glad to go and build those oil rigs and drill up the oil. Alaska is the 70-30 is exactly reversed. Alaska, over the last 40, 50 years, has gotten 30%. 70% has gone to international oil companies. Because Alaskans, well, part of it is Alaskans don't have as much leverage because they're only a state. And if Alaska was independent, I would expect it to be a little, quite a bit more like. But part of it is they just don't drive a hard bargain. Those companies. But people were, if you say, okay, it's happened in Norway, a little bit in Norway, a little bit in Alaska, and a big way in this region, they'll say, oh, but that's just because those are resource rich. But what I say to that is that the difference between a resource rich and a resource poor country is a resource rich country is rich in the type of resources that governments usually charge through the nose for private industry to use, which is basically gas and oil, to some extent other mining industries, but not even so much other mining industries. So-called resource poor countries. So-called resource poor countries are rich in the kind of thing that governments usually give away. They usually give away practically for free, such as the broadcast spectrum, such as urban real estate. You would think of Singapore and Hong Kong as being resource poor, but actually they have some of the most valuable real estate in the world. If they were doing with their real estate what Qatar is doing with its oil and gas, they would have one with a lot more shared benefit in the progress and a lot less poverty. So that's my thoughts on Georgia. Okay, I will say Georgia. But I'm not a Georgist. Don't ever call me Georgia. Any more questions on George before we move on? Yes.
I'm not like intimately familiar with economic structure of like Russia right now.
Yeah.
But since they export their own oil and gas, do they have like a single like tax like?
Well, compared to the huge size of their economy, their oil exports are not big enough to make that huge of an impact. But if you look at everything else, they had a huge opportunity when capitalism and when they were introducing a market economy, when communism ended there 30 years ago. They had a huge opportunity because the state owned everything. They could have introduced the kind of system we have here in Qatar. Instead, they just took all those old communist officials and made them all owners. And they became just this new capitalist ownership class, and then ended up getting kind of a fascist leader. So most of the resources of Russia are going to enrich the oligarchs, not to the people as a whole.
So we're gonna count because it's like an oligarchy.
Yeah. Yeah, and China's not that different. China also, you got these exceedingly rich people on this nominally communist country who control the most important businesses and control the government. Anything else? So, okay, I got a little bit, okay, John Hobson is an anticipator of Keynes, and I've only got 5 minutes, so I don't think I can do him justice. So remind me to bring up Hobson before we talk about Keynes. So I'll talk about Hobson a week from today. But I will talk about Heilbronner's conclusion. Last chapter on pages 211 and 212. Basically what he says is that I think the mainstream people should have paid more attention to the heterodox economists that were flourishing at the time. The heterodox economists, some of them were weird and some of them had some bad ideas, but some of them were hit on some really good ideas. And they were dealing with problems, real problems that the world economy was having that the mainstream simply ignored, even simply to address those problems that the non-mainstream was looking at would have been a big deal. So I'll end there and then I'll bring Hobson up again when we talk about Keynes. All right. Any other questions before I? Yes.
Professor, you say you're not a Georgist, so but do you support single tax?
Yes. Yeah, I support, but There's other thing, there's like a Georgist limit on taxation. They're like, there are Georgists, a lot of Georgists believe that you must tax resources as high as you can, but you must not tax anything else. Some like a belief, there's this, oh, hold on, we're not done because I got one more. There's a conservative aspect of it that I haven't mentioned, is that there's a lower limit on taxes. That's a progressive aspect. You've got to tax all that resource value. But there is the conservative aspect is there's an upper limit to charging the entrepreneur or the worker for what they truly earn by the actions that they do. That is off limits. You're not supposed to tax that at all. I don't think that we can draw a distinction. We can say in general, resources produce this and labor produces that, but labor and resources are always used together and entrepreneurship is used together. And when you use things together, there's never, as much as mainstream economics wants to say there's a marginal value of everything, there's never an exact, you can never really tell what produces something. So you can never really tell to what extent is this cake made by the baker? What extent is this cake made by the flour, the natural resources? Well, you don't get the cake unless you got both. So I don't see any upper limit to taxation. So that conservative aspect of Georgism I don't like, and the business cycle theory I think is I mean, certainly speculation has something to do with the business cycle, but exactly the way George talked about it. So that's why I'm not. That's why I'm not George. All right. See you all a week from today.